Hey, John Gilroy here. Regular listeners know that I enjoy reading books. Today's guest likes to write books, like dozens of them. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today is Gregory Garrett, Chief Operating Officer for some company called REI Systems. Don't have to spell that, do it. It's right in your name, huh, Greg?
Absolutely. Delighted to be here, John.
I would be remiss if I didn't tell the audience that we are recording this at the AWS Summit in lovely downtown Washington, D.C. Yesterday I got here, 7:30 in the morning, line up outside to get here and talk about software and software development. And I thought, who would be a better guest to have old Greg in here? Maybe take the knowledge of his dozens of books he's written and maybe apply it to this whole idea of digital transformation and digital change. And I think REI Systems is right smack in the middle of this fight, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's what we're passionate about.
Good. Well, I want to talk about several things and go right down the list here. My first line of questioning starts off with whirlwind of change. I think if you're living in Kansas and you read about what's going on in downtown Washington, D.C. with certain houses that may be white, there's a lot of change taking place. But separate from that, just forget about the politics in this town. Technology is just swirling around us. I'm surprised that you can keep track of it. So how do you keep track of all this whirlwind change?
Well, it's an ongoing challenge, John. It really is, because there's so much dynamic changes happening in the world of government and federal IT. And there's, of course, a lot of uncertainty right now with the government agencies around their requirements, around their priorities, their funding, and the integration of new and emerging technologies. So it's both an exciting time, it's, you might say, the best of times and the worst of times.
Yes, I read that novel many years ago. Believe it or no one believes this. Believe it or not, I was an NCAA swimmer, and my swim coach was an Olympic coach. And I walked up and said, hey, I want to swim the 100. He said, just beat out Jerry over there. If you can beat him out, you win. He didn't care. He didn't care if I was 6 foot tall, 4 foot tall. He didn't care if I was strong, could swim. Right. If you can beat out that guy, you can be the number one swimmer, and you can be number one in the relay if you want. So competition brought out the best in me, and never beat that number one seed, but it made me a whole lot better swimmer. So competition works. So we talked earlier about how you are trying to use this theory of competition in your own company to improve the way they understand this digital transformation.
Absolutely. You know, back in February, I was looking for ways to motivate our workforce, about 700 really top-notch software developers, engineers, cybersecurity professionals, on what we can do to really help the government do things better, faster, and more cost-effective. And as you mentioned, it's really right up our alley at REI Systems, because REI actually stands for reliability, effectiveness, and innovation. So during the month of March, while others were having March Madness basketball competition, right, and doing the various competitions over who's going to win, we decided to have a REI Innovation Competition and take our team members across the entire company and every functional area, John, from accounting to contracts to finance. We put everybody on a team with software developers and engineers to try to come up with the best and brightest ideas and innovations to help government improve their capabilities, their performance, and reduce cost. And at the end of the day, we came up with more than 100 white papers, had the C-suite executives evaluate them, actually do oral presentations of the top 9 innovation concept papers, and then selected 3 award winners. And all of those, plus many others, we've actually now presented to government agencies, to their CIOs or CTOs, or in some cases the administrators of the agency, and say, here's art of the possible. Is this of interest to you? And some of those are already leading to proofs of concept.
You know, it's fascinating because the people that work for your company aren't like the next 3 people that walk out of the 7-Eleven. They talk about, I've met Innendeal, and this is like taking your top 10 swimmers in the world and say, okay, beat out that guy. It's not me beating out some small college swimmer. It's beat out an Olympic champion or something. So I think that really helps people figure out exactly what's going on. I'm going to bounce some thoughts off of you, and I want you to react. Yesterday, I was sitting in the audience, and there's a guy named Steve Schmidt from AWS, and he is the Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer of AWS. So I was sitting in the audience, and someone walked up to me, and she said, "Hey, you want to interview Steve?" I said, "Sure." So I said, we spent a half hour together asking questions. And what I took out from that is that, AI isn't perfect. AI makes mistakes. In fact, you could ask AI a question once, o'clock in the afternoon, 2 o'clock, get a different answer. And so he said, part and parcel of applying AI is realizing that there is almost a loop involved in, you find out, and you have to feed it back. So I would think if you did go to the 7-Eleven, grab someone, they'd say, yeah, AI, it knows everything. And you may say, well, a more careful approach than just knows everything. Isn't that true?
Oh, absolutely. And I get asked all the time about AI and AI agents and generative AI and what do I think from a cybersecurity perspective. And my typical response is I see a lot of positive, a lot of opportunities for enhancements of capabilities really across all functional areas. But I look at it as a realist, as someone who understands the security implications and the potential for cyber data breaches, for malicious malware, for inaccurate information, because it's always based upon what's the test data that goes into that large language model. And if that data is inaccurate, it's going to drive inaccurate conclusions or inconsistent conclusions, to your point, and that drives bad decisions and bad behavior.
My wife asked me to stay in the front porch last weekend, and so I dutifully did it, and I noticed there was a nail popped up. It happens. So I got a hammer and pounded it back in. Right tool, right application. And I think what Steve said yesterday, that's how you have to approach applying. Remember engineering, applied engineering?
Right.
That's how you apply AI. And the question you should ask is, why can't AI do this? And so instead of saying, yes, it can do everything, well, a chainsaw is not going to help pound that nail on my porch, but a hammer sure will.
Right.
I'm not going to use a hammer to paint the deck. So different tools, different applications. So is that a good question that you ask when you go into these situations of maybe a legacy system upgrade? Is why can't AI do this? Or so where do you apply it?
So I think you can apply AI today at almost every level and every function because there's so many AI agents that have been developed. But again, in the world of government contracts, I have to look at it in the terms of, has this AI been properly vetted? Has it been properly tested? Has it gone through FedRAMP certification testing to meet all the cybersecurity requirements? Because just because something can do something doesn't mean A, you should, and B, that it's really appropriate or been properly tested for potential malware.
When I talk to people at REI, and I talk to probably 40 companies yesterday, they talk about your experience with a grants platform.
Yes.
And working with GSA. So talk about that and how you got teams organized to help move the ball for the federal government in that area.
Well, I'd be happy to. So in our company's 35-year history, we've got more than 30 years of experience in grants management. And we've done that really throughout the federal government and created one of the most robust grants management platforms. And we've developed it as a commercial solution, and we call it GovGrants. And we've implemented that with now more than 20 state governments across the country to help advance how they manage their grants through the grants application process, the grants awards process, and then the post-award to make sure there's no fraud, there's no waste and abuse associated with the work that's being done, and to make it as transparent as possible. And over the past few years, we've spent a lot of time bringing more automation to grants management, so it has a full life cycle capability. And most recently, we brought in AI capabilities with AI chatbots and search features, and so all to make it more cost effective, both at the federal level and at the state level. And so today we're supporting the National Science Foundation, the Department of Veterans Affairs, as I mentioned, numerous state and local government agencies, all in their grants management. And we have one of the biggest grants management platforms in partnership with the Food and Drug Administration and also with the Health and Human Services in an area called the electronic handbooks that are used by HRSA as a part of the Department of Health and Human Services.
I'm a part of the media, believe it or not, and I was in the press room earlier, and they served lunch, and I sat at a table with two women from Peru. I'm always interested in Spanish and different, in different countries in Latin America, one Spanish word can mean different things.
Right.
And so I was asking about different terms I may have heard and back and forth. And I'm just not limited to interest in Spanish and Portuguese, but also in English. There's a phrase that I heard yesterday, and the phrase is vibe coding. And so I'm in the audience, and I'm taking notes dutifully, and I write down vibe coding. And I said, I have no idea what that is. So possibly you can enlighten the audience and me. So what is vibe coding anyway?
So in my, I'll say, humble opinion or advice, vibe coding is really being able to use, I'll say, prompt engineering and prompt terminology to have code written through AI. So you're really just providing questions to prompt the search capabilities that then develops the code associated with it. Most recently, I'll share with you, I had the opportunity to meet the young, bright CEO of a company called Codium. Mm-hmm. And they make, I think, one of the fastest growing AI capabilities for writing code. Mm. And Windsurfer is their flagship product. And a couple months ago when I met with them, it had been generally available for 4 months and already had 7 million users, John, all over the world. And we were having dinner at a very swanky, as you would say, restaurant here in Washington, D.C., and it had sort of a who's who of government contractors from Booz Allen Hamilton to General Dynamics to Deloitte to British Aerospace Engineering, some really, Northrop Grumman, some really fine companies. And so myself and our Vice President of Digital Solutions for REI were delighted to be there. And he was talking about their capabilities and the use of their coding assistant to help bring down the time and the effort, to your point. And he said, when we first started designing this, we thought, it would dramatically bring down the time and cost by 40, 50%. But he said in reality and practice, we find that it's more like 20% reduction of time and overall cost. But still, that's a significant improvement. And again, it's leveraging the power of AI with the human expertise of an experienced software developer.
Years ago, I had I took my students and I introduced them to startup companies. I had a podcast called Students versus Startups, Showdown on the Potomac. And I learned a lot about startups there. And I interviewed startups every week with my students. And I'd ask questions. And I never forget, I talked to one gentleman, and he said, a startup is like, if you race your car at 168 miles an hour, you tip over. But if 167, you lose the race. And so you're at this razor's edge of doing this all the time. And I thought that was interesting. Now let's apply it to today. I saw a press release last week where it said that 95% of tech startups use AI-generated code. I'm saying to myself, are they going to turn over? Are they going to win the race? I mean, I think this is a risky situation, huh? I mean, it indirectly applies to the federal government, but I don't know if Codium applies. But it seems like one has to, what the phrase might be, judicious about applying AI, huh?
I absolutely believe that to be true. I think not only from a efficacy standpoint, are you using it for the right reasons? Is it the large language models really built on reliable data that's drawing its analysis and conclusions? But then again, also, has it been properly vetted and tested so it's free from any malware or any compromise that may have occurred as a part of its development?
I did an interview with a company last year, and we talked about entanglement in quantum communications with satellites. And I spent a week preparing for that interview, and I'm still confused about quantum. I can't, you got me with Schrodinger's cat. I mean, okay, I'll try to learn it one more time, but I think my brain's not big enough for it. But I think the federal government should have a concern when it comes to quantum, because something's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years where everything's going to be turned upside down, and I think AI may be playing in the background, but increasingly, I think this idea of post-quantum, quantum cryptography, this seems to be. So where do you rank it in priorities here for a govie who's listening to this? Is it just, I'll worry about that when it happens, or no, we have to put that higher up in the list?
So it's a great question, and it's one that I take very seriously, and I'll say over the last 5-6 years, I've invested a fair amount of time researching, understanding what tools and technologies are out there, from quantum-resistant algorithms, quantum-resistant technologies, what can be brought to bear to help, because I see it as you do, John, as it potentially a game changer for breaking codes, for being able to decipher any quantum encryption in a unbelievably fast response time, and really breaking the back of cybersecurity as we know it today, right? And so I've invested a fair amount of time understanding what capabilities are out there in the marketplace today, and developing strategic partnerships with some of those companies that have unique capabilities, and trying to educate the CIOs and CTOs that I have the opportunity to talk to in both the public sector and the private sector, to say, hey, these are some of the things you need to start thinking about and planning for in order to have ongoing security and integrity, because quantum computing is coming, and the advantages it offers is significant, but in the hands of bad actors, it could become a game changer for security.
Let's talk about game changers here. Yesterday, I sat on a lunch, and they interviewed a guy named David Sachs. Mm-hmm. And what a background he has. This guy, maybe he understands quantum. I should call him, Dave, hey, give me a 5-minute on quantum. And when he was being interviewed by the AWS guy, and he said, a year ago, they were talking about 10x. Now they're talking about 100x. He's saying it seems like every 6 months they're just adding zeros and x's to the amount of compute, amount of storage, amount of speed. So how can you do any enterprise planning given that amount of change? I mean, it seems like, the story I always tell is that years ago, architects used to design buildings, and one of them designed a round area for the future elevator because they thought it'd be round, not square. So how does an enterprise architecture operate in this David Sachs crazy world?
So it's a great question, and I think there are certain things that we can do today, which things that you and I have talked about previously, like zero trust architecture, right? Like introducing more data segmentation, using cloud-based internet isolation, using least privilege access. There's a host of tools in creating that zero trust architecture that can fence off the data, making it even more difficult to be able to get access to.
I prepare a very sophisticated manner. What I do is I go to Google Trends and type in a phrase. And if it's a hockey stick, I ask a question. No hockey stick, I don't ask the question. And I think if you were to go to Google Trends and type in reduce cost, geographic area Washington, D.C., you'd get a hockey stick, wouldn't you?
You would definitely get a hockey stick
for that.
A lot of opportunities. Yeah. As an old fighter pilot, we'd call it a target-rich zone.
Target-rich environment, something like that. So REI Systems, reducing cost. So this is a big boat you got to move here. So do you move from efficiency and state-of-the-art and safety? Do you take and move that boat over to reducing cost? So, or can you split the boat? Split the baby. Do you split the? So how do you move this ship?
So it's a great question again, and we have to look at it through the lens of our customers, right? And understanding their unique environment. Some are extremely motivated about the cost reductions. But, we have to temper that as a trusted advisor to say, look, we have to make sure we have the appropriate level of security, that there's data integrity associated with it, and there's the right efficacy associated with the use of that particular AI in combination with the software developers and all the practitioners. So it's, I'll say, an ongoing balancing act, to your point. Some of the government agencies that we operate with are willing to take more risk than others. So it's a unique environment that varies by agency.
Well, Greg, once upon a time, you drove to Georgetown University, sat in a classroom with some graduate students. We all sat in a circle, remember?
I do.
And it was Stump the Chump. It was like, no AI here, buddy. There's no calling your mama. It's like, okay. And each one got a chance to ask you questions. They loved it because a human being who's smart and he's going to sit here with us, and they just loved it. So let's have a virtual, if we talk about virtualization here, we have a virtual classroom here, and I got 6 graduate students sitting around this little table here. And so or undergraduate, let's do undergraduates this time. So how would you structure their syllabus? I mean, it just seems like it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen in the next few years, what to study, what not to study. I mean, we both know in and dual, she figured out the right things to study, but the whole idea of critical thinking and analysis, sometimes that doesn't always apply to areas of learning about code.
Right.
Sometimes critical thinking analysis you can learn from philosophy or from history or from fighter pilots. Maybe fighter pilots may have an idea of what critical thinking is all about, huh? I mean, a dumb old fighter pilot, he's thinking critically, and maybe that critical tool set, it has to be applied to AI.
Yeah. So, look, I think some of the best IT people that I've worked with over the years, some of the best CIOs and CISOs come from all different backgrounds. But one commonality is critical thinking, okay? The ability to analyze. And so I find that often scientists and engineers, people who are used to asking tough probing questions and not looking for a single way to solve a problem, I find that people that like playing chess and like strategy and like understanding moves and counter moves often, do well in this, I'll say, very challenging environment. I enjoy it because it's continuous learning, right? And it's like playing multi-dimensional chess where things are changing at all levels.
1 hour ago, I was sitting and talking to an enterprise architect from AWS. My little brain says, this whole idea of putting all the pieces together, and there's a moving target and things changing all the time. What's a good skill set for that? And it dawned on me, one of the first CIOs I ever met was a young man who studied environmental science at UVA. Mm-hmm. So UVA, pretty good school. Environmental science can be challenging, but he learned how to code, and he was thrown into an environment with other software developers, and he was like a pig in mud. He said, this is environmental science, man. So I think critical thinking, it's a perfect fit. It never dawned on me, but that's the perfect fit because systems interacting together. Well, Greg, I think that's what we have when we're modernizing something, huh?
Yeah. Well, years ago, the Air Force recommended to me in the way the military does, which is you shall go and do this, right?
Recommended.
They asked me to go and spend a few years at the University of University of Southern California, and get my Master of Science in Systems Engineering.
Whoa.
And I tell you, it was time very well spent, and it served me really well. I used that to help in the design of a system that you might have heard of called the Global Positioning System, GPS
Never
program.
Heard of it. I didn't use it to get here.
Yeah. So helped design that in the mid-1980s, and having that appreciation for the art and science of pulling together users' requirements and systems and hardware and software and how to integrate all those aspects has really served me well over the years, both in the military as well as an industry executive, and especially in the world that we currently live in, which is such a hodgepodge of technologies, and trying to make them not only have interoperability, which is such a big challenge in the government, because the government has no shortage of IT. They have no shortage of hardware and software. What they have is a big interoperability problem and a big security problem because of that lack of interoperability and systems integration.
And maybe the challenge with systems integration is, I'm thinking about complexity, but putting things out of context. I was listening to a presentation about software developers yesterday, and they're talking about what AI can help you with is if you write some code, you can use different tools. You can say, well, how would this chunk of code react with other parts of the system? But before we do anything, maybe look before you leap and see how it interacts. And that whole idea of you're not an island anymore because you're interacting with so many different things. And so maybe this interacting capability and I guess that's a new way of systems analysis, isn't it?
Yeah. I think part of coding in the future, and by the future I mean next week, right, is being able to do prompt engineering, right, and that vibe coding that we just talked about. It's asking the right questions, and I think to be able to ask the right questions, you have to, one, understand the customer's and operational environment, and you also have to understand the code, right, and how it's written and what it's going to have to interface with to ask the right questions to really optimize the design and the architecture and the integration. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We started this talking that you're an author and you've written 24 books. So I'm going to tell you the next book I'm going to read, and you tell me the next book you're going to write. The next book I'm going to read is called The Swerve, and it's about linguistic analysis of a Roman writer named Lucretius. And that's the kind of stuff I read for fun. So, what's the next book you're going to write?
Well, that's a great question. And honestly, I'll tell you, I'm debating on several topics. But one of them is the interoperability of systems.
Wow, we just hit on that, didn't we? Yeah.
Because I see that's a fundamental challenge in both the public and private sector. And I see it, I'll say, all kinds of opportunities for great examples and case studies from my experience over the past several years in both the public and private sector and having worked all around the world.
That's interesting. We'll have to wait till that comes out, Get to work, you lazy guys. Only 24 books. You got to have something to do on your way home. Maybe you're driving home and dictating in your car. That's the image I have of you, getting all these books. Well, unfortunately, Greg, we're running out of time here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Gregory Garrett, Chief Operating Officer at REI Systems, and I'll keep a link to their site in the show notes. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, John.